Well, I started as an academic. I was appointed in 2015, but before then, I'd been a student in the department. And during my master's program, I was the only female student of about 12 students. And since then, I had the feeling that I can actually push forward and pursue a career in the academics, considering the fact that I have the support of my father to have a career in the academics. And so that was how I got the motivation to move on and intensify my research activities. Initially, I was teaching African history at the College of Education in Oyo State, but subsequently, after my PhD, and I more like started a new career at the university, and I was also appointed to teach and research. And so, since I started working at the Department of History, University of Ibadan, I deceived of the set of recruitment that brought me in, of about three of us. I was the only female that got appointed. And so we started off. And I think since then, I've been the only female lecturer in the department. And we have a kind of an academic staff strength of about 12. And of the 12, I still remain the only female. I won't say it's been that, I won't see it as a kind of disadvantage, really, but I see it as a kind of advantage, and I see it as a source of motivation to keep pushing and try to prove my capacity as a female among men in the department. And I think somehow the structure of the university itself is not gender biased, because it's even part of the gender policy of the university that a female should be, at least a female should be in every academic department of the university. So I see it as a kind of opportunity, being a female in such setting, to always try to prove myself and to always ensure that I make the best of the opportunity. And so far, the way the University of Ibadan has engaged its process of decolonization as a whole hasn't been really gender biased, in the sense that the idea of decolonization has been manifesting at the University of Ibadan since the 1950s. Because then I did a kind of research and I published a paper on how University of Ibadan tried to engage in the international space. And I realized that the idea of decolonization in University of Ibadan, in fact, started from the history department of the university, because initially European history was being taught through the 1940s and 50s. But scholars of African history at the department negotiated with Europeans then that they can't be teaching European history in African settings, so they need to teach African history. But then there was the argument that there was no content to teach in African history. And so this jeered scholars of Africa based in Africa to start researching African history using oral traditions and biographies. And so subsequently, this constituted the curriculum of African history at the University of Ibadan. For me, I see that as a process of decolonizing the curriculum itself. And I mean, generally, there hasn't been any kind of gender bias in the university. It's a space that accommodates men and women. But of course, that doesn't mean that there are no limitations to engage women or to assist women in obtaining career in the academics in Africa. Due to colonial experiences in Yoruba land of Western Nigeria, it was obvious that education was a path to prosperity. Education then, especially in the colonial era, was seen as the only gateway to become a kind of civilized, no doubt. And the indigenous people then accepted that fact. They accepted the practice of being educated as part of everyday life. Now, that acceptance will further change the feelings about religion. Of course, we all knew that Christianity was the a kind of a twin to Western education. That once Christianity, there's Christianity, there will be Western education in the way it was projected into the colonized societies, no doubt. But then the Muslims who had been in the society before the colonial era, because majority of the indigenous people, especially in West Africa, before colonialism, were basically Muslims. And they were basically Muslims because they've had some sort of civilization through the trans-Saharan trade and contact with the Arabs. So there had been a form of indigenous civilization that defined everyday life before colonialism. Now with colonialism, the education, the perceptions about education changed. And that change, to the Muslims, initially there was a kind of apathy because they felt that it's a foreign civilization. They felt that it's a kind of civilization that will erode the Muslim cultures and ways of life that had been in existence. But then it was again realized that the whole concept of the education itself, in the Western sense, the Muslims were able to interpret it. I prefer to use the word interpret and adapt to being to a kind of Muslim life in Western Nigeria. And that interpretation and adaptation to the Muslim life is why I say the Adini Dunia nexus had always been a kind of philosophy that resonates in the way people think about the Western education that was brought to Western Nigeria then. And so somehow the Muslims decided to engage Western education, having in mind a philosophy that while you go to school and you get educated in the Western sense, you are still going to be a Muslim, because the perception is you actually need that education to survive in the society. Yeah, the responses are in varying perspectives. Initially, there was apathy, and the apathy was also, there was also a twin concept to the apathy, which I call deprivation. When there was apathy, then when there was deprivation brought about apathy, in the sense that when Muslims children are being prepared for enrollment into primary and secondary schools, then I think from the late 1880s to the early 20th century, once you get to school and your name is, let me say, Jami, and then there will be this deprivation that, okay, before we can enroll you to school here, you change your name to Joseph. And so that's from Jamie to Joseph context actually changed a lot about how education is perceived in the society then. Some Muslims decided to adopt Joseph, change their identity to Joseph, but some still found a way of just bearing that Joseph identity at the school, but back home they retained that Jamia identity. Some people switched entirely. I think there are some studies that already talked about that religious conversion among the Yoruba. Some people switched entirely, and those that decided not to enroll at all were the ones that actually um, that we can characterize that they have exercised apathy, because they decided to go back home and just exist like they were, or like life was in the pre-colonial era, even in the 20th century. And so that dynamics changed a lot of things about how Muslims see themselves in the society at that point in time. But somehow, I think due to the influence of the missionaries in India, Pakistan, who had had contacts with United Kingdom, I'm talking about Muslim missionaries now, they kind of introduced some forms of reformed Islam at that point in time into Yoruba land. because they introduced their own dimension of a civilizing mission. And the categories of Muslims that keyed into that, the Ahmadiyya civilizing mission then, were actually fortunate to get educated. And once they were educated, especially in the early 20th century, and once they got educated, they began to reform the idea of being educated and being a Muslim in the 20th century. Of course, the ideology of Ahmadiyya became kind of rejected along the line. Some actually rejected that ideology and they moved on to, though the ideology was rejected, but the idea about education, the idea of a Muslim lifestyle in Yoruba land was projected into the society. So those are the basic things that could define how Muslim communities reacted to the civilizing mission. Of course, it became imperative that there was also group formation. When it was obvious that the Christian missionaries were engaged in various activities, the Muslims, even though group formation is something that had been part of Muslim communities, the Muslim community itself is a group. But with colonialism and the colonial economy in Lagos and some western cities in Western Nigeria in 20th century, it was obvious that the idea of group formation took another dimension because cities are being formed. And so I also argue that urbanization and cosmopolitanism, in one way or the other, also influenced how Muslim communities responded to the civilizing mission of the Christians.